We have some comparisons that Orange County had recently done. We took their list and we sent it out to everybody. We reached out to these counties as well, and it kind of seems like we're getting a little bit different feedback from what we see in this actual document. Todd's actually reached out to some of the counties, but do you want to?
We didn't receive the grant, we just got the summary. It's not table.
They should have.
I did not get that. I didn't get
Okay.
I think it's called Orange County.
Yeah.
Thank you. We just like being spoon-fed by Chelsea.
Yeah. Okay. So like we have Alachua County, they have buffers for OFW. That's 150 feet on average. We actually have up here. You might have seen. Did you get this?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So that information was pulled out of here and put in here, so it's easier for you guys to understand. And this was also kind of vetted by Todd. He talked to these counties. This is comparison based on what we do versus what other counties do. Conservation easement. Yeah.
I'm just curious, is there no code for Flagler or Orange or Lake or Marion counties?
Not in the Orange County comparison document. Not every county has a wetland ordinance.
So just as background, so Orange County is in the middle of doing a significant rewrite of their wetland code. And part of that was they hired a consultant to do a comprehensive study of how their code compares to other codes. Theirs is really complicated, and every wetland impact that is permitted, and they actually call it something else, has to go before their elected body. So in the case of Orange County, the commission has to approve every wetland impact, where we do that through permitting at the staff level. They have different criteria. They have different wetland classes, right? So some are more protected and some are less protected, although all are protected. And Bill, it sounds like you must work there and have some knowledge of their thing. So they're in the process of this rewrite because their process is very cumbersome. And so in part of that, their consultant interviewed the other counties. We were one of the counties they interviewed. So their report has just recently been released. And so we used that as our homework for this, right? Because they've really done the work already. So that's why you'll see that this document is from Orange County. And then this chart is really just distilling the long report into some of the things that we actually care about. But I don't know, Bill, do you want to talk about theirs or?
Well, historically, they had 3 classes. I think it's based on size, and you could get and also connectivity. You could get a permit for the class 3. I don't remember if it goes up or down with staff, I think. And then 2 and 3, you do have to go to county commission to get that. They call them conservation areas, which is confusing, so they're going to change the name of that. But that's what I recall.
Question on the summary chart. When it says the mitigation is conservation easement, I see it outlined in the website document somewhere where it just says the remaining wetlands in a conservation easement. Are there any of these that have conservation easement where it is you're putting the same volume of land in a conservation easement elsewhere, or is it just you're conserving the rest of it? Okay.
A lot of it wasn't very clear in their ordinances, so I had to call each county individually. Some of them I never got back to me.
Mm-hmm.
The ones I spoke to, that's how
They just conserve the rest of it and then.
and then they add whatever.
Could you restate that, please? I didn't quite hear your full answer.
So what she was asking is, the way it's stated in there is that the way it's stated in there is that the remainder of the wetland is not being impacted as based on the CE. And in some of the counties, they add additional buffer, either buffer area or additional wetlands into that to make up for the spot that's being impacted.
Any questions?
Yeah, I didn't understand where it said 150% of market value on the mitigation in Alachua County. What does that mean?
So that's one of the reasons I had to call them, because it wasn't clear on their website or in their ordinances. So that is exactly what it sounds like it means. So they use either they can hire a private appraisal, or if they were sold recently, they can use that value as the
Yeah,
Oh, I
value
see.
of the
So,
land.
100% of the value
I
of the
see,
land.
I see, okay. It's the land.
Jack, did you have another question? No, okay. Does anybody else have any other questions about the review of the other counties? Sarah Lee?
Of these counties, who, I see, under Hillsborough, it says no impact within 500 feet of 3 main rivers. Who has an OFW? Does anybody besides us have an OFW?
Yeah, there are other OFWs throughout the state, depending on the state water body. The state makes that determination of what's an outstanding Florida waterway.
So are they treating the area near the OFW differently than otherwise? How, you know?
Yeah, I mean, if it's just a regular wetland or water body and it doesn't have that classification, then there are smaller buffers.
So on these maximum buffers, because Alachua at 150, but everybody else's is 50, that is interesting to me. What, is something unique there?
The other one, I don't know why.
There's the OFW is 100 foot,
Yeah.
150
Feet.
Okay.
Yeah. And a minimum 100 feet. So you have the average, and then you have a minimum 100. I don't know why we chose 50. I don't know why they chose 50. We discussed this in the last meeting, that a lot of the research papers that we have looked at, they all recommend, what was it, 300 and, at least 300 feet, or 330 feet, something like that, roughly for wetland buffers that are wildlife dependent. So a lot of the buffer information that we've read is far in excess of 50 feet.
Tyler and then Jack.
So I want to partially answer Sarah Lee's question. In the state level code for OFWs, because OFWs are something we deal with like St. John's or South Florida Water Management District, they have more stringent water quality criteria, or stormwater ponds are held to a higher standard of design, but they don't have substantial differences, at least Bill could correct me if I'm wrong, but that I'm aware of within what we're talking about here, yeah, with buffers. St. John's doesn't have different buffers for OFWs, do they? No, it's just the water quality difference.
Yeah, the RHPs have it.
Yeah, yeah, and so we do have some difference in the code on the state level, but it's not as substantial as what's being shown here. So Keith just made a statement that I might just be remembering wrong, but you said that there's multiple studies that are suggesting larger buffers. And I think previously it had been presented that there was a UF study of St. Johns County that had presented
There was also one by St. John's River Water Management District that dealt with the RHPZs, specifically in this county, it's Brown.
Brown and Harmon.
Yeah, yeah.
And if I may interject, what the St. Johns County study showed was that at a 300-foot buffer, you are getting substantial protection of species, both upland species that are wetland dependent, as well as wetland species. If you drop that to a 150-foot buffer, you are preserving 50% or less of those species. And you also have concerns at the smaller buffer widths regarding the ability of what happens with erosion, the ability to clean water as it re-enters our aquifer, to attenuate for chemicals and substances and sediment entering the water, and that the more vegetated those buffer areas are, the better. So essentially, it seems to me that we are looking at numbers that we don't know the substantiation for the 50-foot buffer or the 25-foot buffer. We don't have a scientific paper that gives us guidance on why that was good. What we have been given establishes that if we value the ability of wetlands to clean water, to protect our water supplies, which is a very big deal. I don't know how much you're following that in the news. I would imagine a lot. And if we value wildlife, even the upland species that are dependent on that wetland, then we need to probably talk a little bit more about how to do something that's reasonable where Orange County has different types of wetlands. It's a tough one.
Well, I think what I would counter to that is that wetlands aren't typically our aquifer recharge zones, or hydrologic recharge zones are typically sandy soil uplands over karst, K-A-R-S-T, areas of lime rock. We have a lot of those in Ocala. We have like basically everything on the northeast side of Lake Apopka is the Wekiva River Basin hydrologic recharge zone. So we do have those areas, but it's actually upland areas, and it's important that we look at how we deal with stormwater so that we maintain infiltration into the ground. But I disagree with the premise that the expansion of buffers is impacting our aquifer water quality on wetlands.
I think we need more information on that. The state of Florida is karst. I'm sure you saw that wonderful, The Journey of Water, where they went underground all the way from South Florida up into Gainesville through the connected underground springs. So the water does move. And this is a relevant discussion. This is going to be hard work for us because we have to balance types of wetlands and wetland functions because we are also a county with a designated sole source aquifer. That decision was made in 1986. So our water supplies are something we have to take care of, whether that's stormwater, which we've discussed. Now we have to talk about what we do with wetlands. Jack.
Yeah, I'm curious about about rivers and in particular the 500-foot no impact area that they had established there in I guess it was Hillsborough County. Do we have any idea where they came up with that number?
I can read you their actual excerpt from their code if that would help.
Well, maybe if they
says-
if they explain it.
Kinda. Land alteration activity which destroys, reduces, impairs, or otherwise adversely impacts a wetland within 500 feet of the Hillsborough, Alafaya, or Little Manatee River shall be prohibited regardless of any other regulatory agency authorization. The 500 feet shall be measured from the jurisdictional line established by the EPC for wetlands and natural resource bodies.
Okay. That seems like a good idea, but I don't know that that gives us a reason to get there. But my other question, and this is maybe going to come up later, is relative to these other folks and perhaps Orange County, which is looking at it. Do you have any impression of one that's probably most reasonable? In other words, that you would suggest as being closer to what we should look at? I asked that in a general question.
What buffer is appropriate?
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying? I believe one of the previous meetings, we had a list of what we had taken
Right.
to council. I believe it was 7, I can look that up for you
Well,
and see, and put it up there on the list. But I believe it was something like 75 feet in Eco and Norma, and then 50 feet everywhere else, but I'll
Right.
look it up.
Yeah, I was really trying to make a reference on what other folks were doing and what was most similar to them, but, right, and another county and saying, we are looking at something more similar to Alachua or some other county versus just our own.
Yeah, Osceola had the 50 feet, right?
What did they predicate that on?
Because I'm sharing, I can't. It's like
I don't know that we know, without going back and maybe listening to audio of whenever they adopted their ordinances,
first
why
meeting?
people chose one number
Yeah,
over another. You know, our ordinance, of course, was adopted some time ago. There won't be audio for those meetings, and none of us were here. But same with the other organizations, right? We don't necessarily know how they come up with the number they come up with, unless they've recently changed their ordinance, like Orange County is.
Yeah,
doing.
so here's where I'm kind of struggling a lot, actually. So we're the Environmental and Natural Resources Advisory Committee, and we're supposed to review and update all the environmental ordinances with the best information we have. And as Ginger says, I think our wetland ordinance probably goes back to the late 80s, right? And we know more, and we have a lot more population in our area, and we know the difficulties that we face with water, and we're not adding more land to the world. So the information that we have been given to utilize in this is information that says, certainly in areas like Norma or Eco, where we've designated that as our most precious environmental land in the county, we should probably have a discussion about strengthening. And these 25 feet, 50 feet seem very arbitrary to me. I would like to know what they're based on when we have on the other side competing information that says, okay, you can do these different distances from the wetland, and these are the consequences that will occur when you make the distances greater or you make them smaller. And to me, it seems that is what we have to weigh. And what that also seems to point to me, and it's not great, is it seems to point to doing something like what Orange County is doing, but making it much more reasonable, somehow more workable, that not all wetlands are created equal. And what are the ones that absolutely have to be conserved, and in what way and in what measure? And what are the ones that we treat more arbitrarily or sacrifice?
So, yes, that is what we struggle with, right? In the absence of any specific data that says this is the number, and that's why we look to the St. John's study, because that's what they were struggling with when they, started that study. Like, what should the buffers be in our county, right? And some of that depends on what is your tolerance for, in that study in particular, protection of wildlife, right? Like, as you mentioned, if you want to protect almost all of the wildlife, you're looking at 300 feet of buffer based on that study. If you're willing to accept some amount of mortality, then you reduce the buffer, right? And so then we don't have that sort of study here specifically in Volusia County. That's the closest thing we have. And then you get to the arguments about, okay, if in the perfect world 300 feet is the right number because we're going to protect the wildlife that are dependent on wetlands, what is the reality in terms of the economic cost of that? And, so I think that's why we end up with these numbers that we all have, all of these counties have, right? It's a number, is 25 feet the right number, is 50 feet the right number? It's a balance between what maybe the science would tell us, and the science is sparse, and then, what the rest of the community values, and what the, governing bodies of these different municipalities are willing to live with. So that's a long-winded way of saying there's not going to be a perfect number, I don't think. I think there's discussion to be had here about, do we like what we have now? Are we protecting what we want to protect? If not, do we need to identify greater protections, and is that a geographic thing like Norma and Eco, because those have been already designated as being the areas in the county that we want to protect? Or is it, there are models that use wetland function as the different sort of buffer and minimization, avoidance and minimization criteria, right? It's based on the quality of that wetland. There are pros and cons of doing that. So we have a few options, but, maybe some basic questions that the group should agree on before we can say, is 27 the number? Is 52 the number? I think it's a negotiated number. I think all of these counties, it's a negotiated number. It's not just purely based on science.
And I think we're aware that there's a negotiation, but I think we have to be as clear-eyed as we can possibly be what the trade-offs are. And I don't know if we're all comfortable with the information we have. I mean, our guidance on this says no net loss in size or function of the wetlands. Do we include only water quality under function, or do we also include the value for instance, recreational fishing for the small fry that live in wetlands, things like that, And Jessica, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, so I'd like to say something. If you're talking about buffers and water quality, I would suggest that when you impact an upland habitat and you avoid the wetland by 25 feet or whatever, the stormwater management plan will conceivably take care of the water quality. Having that buffer, that little 25-foot or 50-foot or 100 feet, isn't necessarily going to increase the water quality of the water that's running into the wetland because you're capturing it and you're treating it. But if you want to talk about wildlife, that's true. I mean, and I don't know if this is a wetland ordinance and we're trying to get at wildlife preservation, but yes, wildlife needs more than 25 feet to live out their life cycles. But I don't know if we want to try to regulate wildlife in a wetland ordinance. Second of all, looks like most of these are 50-foot max with a like a 30-foot minimum. And if we are going to talk about increasing buffers on wetlands in this ordinance, we should definitely have an average. Right now, the way the NERMA one is set up is it's 50 feet straight up. You cannot change that. And even if you get into it, 1 foot, you are now into the whole wetland alteration permit process. So wildlife and water quality are two different things that we should be thinking about.
Jessica.
Yeah, I think I was going to point out, one, I do think that we will, at some point, as a group, discuss the habitat preservation and that kind of element, but I think it spreads throughout, just like we said with trees, all of these things will function together. I agree with the averaging concept. I think we've talked about that a bit. I just wanted to raise when Ginger notes, a standard width and averaging. Do we look at quality? I'm wondering if there are other examples in the code where it may have, in NORMA here it's a 100-foot buffer, unless you illustrate that it is isolated in a certain quality that, doesn't have a potential value. It will always have value, but a threshold value. And maybe then there is a separate buffer or a separate limitation. I don't know if you've seen any of that in the code. Right.
That used to be the case in Ormond, the city of Ormond Beach. Their code was much like that. It was tiered based on function. I think they found that cumbersome to enforce, and in fact, not that long ago, they did away with their code more or less completely. There are some inherent problems with using function as the delineator because, so you could use the UMAM, the assessment method, to determine function. And you could say, if it's this functional score or above, then it's higher protection. And if it's this functional score and below, it's lower protection. And what I think would happen is that we're all going to be fighting over that 7 and 7.1, right? Like, does the consultant say it's this and we say it's that? And, so there's just some inherent issues with that. It could work. It's not to say that it couldn't work, but chances are we'd have a lot of talk about, we'd see a lot of 6.9 wetlands come in, I think, right? Maybe my cynical nature, but.
It's going to be subjective of their scientific judgment. I've dealt with this with UMAMs. Pretty much most consultants are going to say that most wetlands in this county are going to fall probably, and I think Bill has said this before, 5 or 6. That's just where they're going to fall. They're going to say there are invasive species in there. They've been impacted in the past. It's going to be rare to even hit a 7 in a UMAM score.
Is that what you see? Yeah.
Yeah. So you'd have to set that threshold so low. You'd have to set it at like a 3 or a 4, maybe, something like that, and to make any kind of difference whatsoever.
But, there are some other things you could do, right? You could look at, is it connected, right, to some other wetland or water body, so you could use connectedness. But there are a lot of arguments to be said that those isolated wetlands are critically important too, because, that's where some species live that they can't live if they're connected to something, because then there are predators there, right? So, it's not, there's complications no matter which way you choose, and I'm convinced we're not going to find a perfect way, but good to have the different conversations about, like, can you delineate them? That's partly why we've so far landed on the geographic region as the delineator, because there's precedent in the comp plan that say these specific areas have been identified as really important. And if we want to protect those areas, as the comp plan says, then maybe that's where there's warranted some additional, additional avoidance and minimization, maybe additional buffers, whatever. And in the areas that are urbanizing, maybe we don't look at those additional protections, because those are the areas we've designated in all of our plans as, their expectation of growth, right? So.
And what happens is, once you set these minimum standards, if you don't have any consideration of value or connectedness or anything like that, you get a ditch or something, and it just doesn't pass the straight face test, because then you're saying, okay, you got to avoid and minimize that impact, and there's a buffer on it, and you got to avoid and minimize that 50-foot buffer on top of a ditch. And developers or people just say, that is just crazy, and you can't get past that because now it's in rule.
Well, technically, there's always permitting. These are the minimum standards, and we have the wetland alteration permit. And again, if there's some sort of activity or development, you can always appeal to the DRC and, have them, grant approval for a waiver or a permitting process. It's
Liz.
less complicated here than it seems anywhere else.
Yes, I'd like to see the map showing Norma, and then I've asked before about the map showing the commercial space opportunity overlay.
Map that has all the layers that
Okay.
were requested.
Yay.
It's going to be kind of hard to see if you can zoom in to the coastal area, straight in.
Is there any way you can minimize the views of Samantha
Can we
and
maximize the,
and maximize the screen?
can you get his attention?
I'm not as familiar with Teams as Zoom.
Yeah, I don't know how to maximize. Winston. Hey, can we maximize? Is there a way to maximize
dude.
just this map area?
Yeah, I'm sharing my screen onto there, but we want to make sure that where it has our names up at the top where it says Bree, me, and you, to make that smaller so we can make the share screen bigger. Yeah.
Okay, I was going to just talk about Norma and the commercial space opportunity overlay for a moment.
Yeah. So
Norma,
yeah.
Now, I don't have all the
You're going to have to zoom in.
information on Norma, but it seems to me that it was created back in the 80s with a wide brush of everything that was in the unincorporated area of the county. And if you look at the cities, and if you annex into the cities, it seems,
You have to zoom
it
in
appears
close
to
get
me
the-
that when you annex in, Norma goes away.
Yes, Norma does not survive annexation.
So, one, we're incentivizing annexation. And two, and this is where the comprehensive commercial space opportunity overlay comes into being, is the county and the private economic development organizations and a lot of private companies in Volusia County have spent millions of dollars saying Volusia County is open for business. We have been targeting aviation and aerospace and advanced manufacturing for years. Now, we're inviting them to come here. Come, we welcome you, we welcome you. And in the other, okay, so now they get here, and now they're finding out we have burdensome regulations that they can't even get to the starting gate because of the cost, because of just the avoidance language is a deterrent right off the bat. So it's a contradictory message. We're welcome. We've even got a nice new comprehensive overlay for the space industry, which everything is supposed to be fast-tracked. But on the other hand, we want to impose greater regulations.
So, excuse me for jumping in, but in May of 2020, with the county, there was a review of the space overlay, and I participated in that. I'm sorry Clay's not here to kind of walk us through what those decisions were. I have my paperwork all here, but I'm not gonna, it would take me time to reread it and understand that. But we went through a full review of what types of industries would be allowed in that area and what wouldn't be, for instance, no fracking. And that should have been, at that time, harmonized with the other ordinances of that area. I don't know, Ginger, do you remember this at all?
Let's let Sam show you kind of what you can see up here, and then that might help a little bit.
Yeah, Cesayo follows the coastline, comes down to 92, comes all the way into the land, and then comes down 17 all the way back to the county border. So this area, which is relatively new, was actually encompassed, pretty much the area that we said we wouldn't have a lot of growth in the center of the county, which was Norma and Eco.
So the areas that you're seeing that are in white on the screen here, within this area, this is all in the Cesayo overlay. So the white is unincorporated areas that are outside of the natural resource protection area, so outside of Norma. Norma is the yellow. So, and the gray is the cities.
Can we put up Eco?
And if I put Eco on, that's the orange that you see now. So everywhere that's white, outside, inside of this boundary, county boundary in the ocean, inside of this, is going to be unincorporated areas outside of those overlays for development. An expedited review for the Cesayo.
So that is where we have elected to develop in our comp plan and our future land use.
I don't know that that means that's where we've elected to develop. I think the Cesayo was the area where there would be, so fast track permitting if there were, aviation related industries that come in. It doesn't do away with any of the regulations that existed in the area, but it does talk about trying to help facilitate those things that come in and a process, I think, more than any kind of waivers of any of the rules that apply.
But
Not
to
an
her
expert,
point-
though, in the CISO, so.
But to Bliss's point, we may not want to increase buffers or more avoidance minimization in those regions because we are trying to encourage growth in those areas.
I don't think we're trying to encourage growth in the eco and in the norma in those areas. We would have to pull that language, and you may know better than I do about what the language is in the overlay itself, but we can pull that up and look at it in the
And could
comp
we look at
plan.
the space overlay again, please, that map, just quickly?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to tell because it's just a red dotted outline, but it's pretty much, I mean, based on this right here, yes, when she clicks on it, you can see it disappear. It comes all the way down around 92 into DeLand, down 17, back to the county border, and then all the way around. It encompasses, yeah, pretty much most of the wetlands in the county. I mean, Spruce Creek's in there. Do we think Spruce Creek should be filled in and a spaceport put on top of it? I mean, was that the intention?
And OFW.
Yeah, and an RHPZ.
Yeah, and maybe not the areas that are like that, or Norma.
Or eco,
But,
yeah.
or eco, but in the areas outside of that, maybe we don't increase the buffer. So maybe it's not only function, but also, zoning or
I think that's what
overlay.
Ginger was
Right.
saying. I've lost track of who's in order, but I'll go around this way. Sarah Lee, are you still?
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's an overlay. It's an overlay, which means it does not negate any of the things that are underneath it. Those things that are underneath it are still as valuable as they were. It is an overlay district that helps, and it makes sense. One, you wanted to include areas that have infrastructure, which should be the cities, right? And secondly, we're talking about aerospace, right? So aerospace has a connection to Embry-Riddle and Titusville, So it's a locational thing that you set, it's an easy boundary, that makes sense. But it's an overlay district, which should not and does not negate anything that's underneath it. It just says, this is the geographic area that is a priority for us from an economic development standpoint for this specific industry. And I think this discussion we're having about whether or not to expand or change buffers for a environmental purpose in this area needs to be weighed against this other important issue that has been identified. But the other thing that in listening to the discussion, I personally, based on my previous experience, I'm not interested in seeing us go into a functional analysis. I see that as another way to complicate things and not necessarily gain anything. I think we have Norma and ECO that have already gone through many processes in this county, and OFWs. And if we want to do some change and/or evaluate a standard and change that standard, let's look at locationally and consider, these areas that we've already identified as being important and critical, we're not questioning it, and look at it that way. I am not in favor of going into functional analysis on wetlands.
Bob, then Tyler, then Jessica. Oh, Ginger, go ahead.
I'm looking at the staff report from when the CISO was proposed to the council, and it says that the purpose is to help to facilitate the development of that type of industry. It says that the overlay ensures potential impacts to environmental resources are minimized. Nothing within the overlay shall preempt the natural resource management area overlay or the environmental core overlay. Protection of wetland, floodplain, and habitat resources will not be compromised. It says that targeted industries will be encouraged to locate where they have access to transportation, utilities, and multimodal transportation. It provides for coordination with the river to sea transportation planning organization to improve the road network, et cetera. And looking at ways to implement on-site infrastructure to facilitate development in areas where it's appropriate. So
That's what
just
Sarah Lee said too, then. It's an overlay. It's what Sarah Lee was saying too. It's an overlay.
Yeah, so just for a little background.
Okay, Bob?
To kind of segue in on what Sarah Lee was saying, I think, rather than getting into the weeds and all the details, messing with Norma or Echo, we've got to come to an agreement, I think, on a concept. And, I would hope everybody around the table understands that we have to grow and that we are going to grow regardless of the kind of regulations we promulgate. We can have the worst regulations in the world, the most restrictive. We're still going to grow. What we're going to do is pervert the way we grow and what we attract. So if we want to be well balanced, we have to promote growth and think about things, not address them at this committee level, but to think about things like the jobs that come from manufacturing, like the houses where the people have to live, that are engaged in those things. To that end, we really do have to figure out a way to say, look, these areas are designated for growth, and these areas need to have minimalistic types of controls that create as little economic impact as possible. Whereas over here, hey, you want to come over here? That's fine, but you're playing by a whole different set of rules.
Yep.
So that's kind of where I wanted to go with that. And, along those lines, how much discretion does staff have in the ordinance to say, hey, this is a really poor wetland and this is a situation where, we really probably don't even need 10 feet of buffer? Does staff have that ability within the ordinance?
We have discretion on to what meets the code requirements of avoidance minimization and permitting. So if it's a ditch, per se, and there's, you need to build a house there, right? Well, we're going to permit the house. I mean, that's a need. If you have a vested lot for a home, we're going to permit the home there. If you're not showing that you are meeting avoidance minimization, we also have the ability to deny the permit. We have many situations where we permit impacts to wetlands and buffers for all sorts of things: pools, accessory structures, ADUs, homes. So it is up to staff. I mean, the size of the buffer doesn't change, but we can permit the impacts to said buffer and wetlands.
You have the discretion to say, well, the wetland really isn't here, it's over here, or it's not as significant, no?
No, so there was a few things to unpack in that. Where the wetland is defined by state statute.
Right.
I mean, two people could maybe disagree a little bit, two biologists might call the line a little bit differently, but the state statute governs the definition of the wetland, and those discrepancies are typically worked out in the field or whatever. So where the wetland is where it is. What the buffer is what it is. It's what the code says. The buffer is 25 feet or the buffer is 50 feet. Where there is some discretion is in the permitting of impacts, right? Because the code says there is a buffer and it is this big. It doesn't say you can't touch the buffer. It says if you're going to impact the buffer, you have to get a permit and you have to provide mitigation. So none of this is saying you shall not touch it. It's just saying that in order to impact it, you are subject to permitting. And a lot of our discussion last time, and I would guess at some point today, is about how we interpret that avoidance and minimization. That's where there's some discretion. Is have you met the criteria that says I have done everything I can to protect this wetland or buffer, and I am able to then permit what I can't protect, right? That's where there's some discretion.
Yeah, and in that mitigation element of this is where I think there should be a great deal of difference between whether or not you're building in areas that have been designated for growth or building in areas that have been designated as preservation.
So when we get to mitigation, that's also pretty standard, right? Because there is now this state uniform mitigation assessment method. And that's what everybody uses to decide how much mitigation is required for wetland impacts. So if you impact this wetland, the way you figure out how much your mitigation is what did the wetland look like based on this state assessment prior to your impact, and what will it look like after the impact? So that's not like us saying, well, we like you and your mitigation can be less, or that wetland wasn't that great. That's standardized. Again, there's some scientific judgment, right? Like Bill might say one thing and another consultant might say a little bit different thing, but the method is the method and everybody uses the same one.
But everyone doesn't use the same mitigation values, do they? I mean, from county to county, city to city, an acre here may cost another acre in a mitigation bank, whereas an acre here may cost 10 acres in a mitigation bank.
Yeah, no.
So you're kind of, to her point about.
I'm trying to understand it because I know that there's drastically different values placed on the mitigation. So the cost of the credits.
We have a
the impact,
comparative
yeah,
document.
but that's only.
Vastly different. So
Yeah.
you can explain it because I don't
Okay.
understand why there's such a difference.
So the value of the wetland that you're impacting is going to be evaluated with the UMAM, and you do get, you'll have differences, but you will get to an agreement with the agencies, no matter if it's St. John's, Army Corps, county, about the value of the impact. Then you go to a mitigation bank that's in your basin, and those banks have just market value costs. And you buy mitigation according to how much credit you need. If you impacted, say, an acre of a 0.5 acre wetland, a half an acre wetland, an acre wetland at a 0.5 value from 0 to 1, or from 0 to 100%, 50% wetland, then you need a half of a credit of mitigation. Then you go to the bank and you buy a half a credit of mitigation. The costs are different in the basins because it costs more or less to set up the mitigation bank.
If you look at the screen, we have a document.
That was part of the packet.
Yeah.
That's different. But what I hear you asking is the avoidance minimization and whether or not the county can say, yes, you can impact this or not. That's really what we're talking about here. So when you go to the county and you say, or the water management, the county, and you say, if we've increased these buffer widths and we have increased their ability to say you have to avoid and minimize, then they have the ability to say, no, you don't get that wetland impact. It doesn't matter how much it costs, doesn't matter how valuable the wetland is, a 0.3 or a 0.7, you cannot have that impact because we think that you can avoid it. You can still make money in a project, but you can avoid it. That's really what we're talking about here.
And we have some language in there about reasonable use, and we'll get to all of those points too at some point in time of the day. But
We did talk a lot last time about the cost to do mitigation if you pay into the wetland mitigation fund here in Volusia County instead of buying bank credits or whatever. So there are cases where you'll have an impact. Typically, this is only when your impact does not also require mitigation from a state agency. So let's say you're building a dock and it's exempt from state permitting, or it's a buffer impact, which the state isn't going to permit. Then, and you're assessed mitigation based on this uniform mitigation assessment method, right? So you're building your dock, here's how much impact you're having, here's the mitigation that's required. Here in the county, you can choose to go buy a bank credit for that, or you can choose to pay into our mitigation fund. In that case, that might be way different than some other county's mitigation fund. But most often, if it's an impact that requires some sort of state permitting and mitigation, you're going to buy bank credits because that's what the state's going to accept, and we're going to accept those same credits. We don't charge again for the same impact. So big projects with big wetland impacts, they're buying bank credits, they're not paying into our fund. And that's the market, that's all free market. How much the bank credits cost is whatever they can charge for them. But if you're doing buffer impacts or you're doing something that is state exempt and you're buying our credits, you're paying our mitigation fee, which we talked about and probably are still going to talk about.
Yeah, and I just want to make a point that I've heard several times, that we have to decide where we're going to grow. We've already done that. We have land use designations, we have ESC, we have RC, we have zoning, we have NORMA, we have ECO, we have all these areas. All that has already been decided.
These airplanes are backing up. I'm going to let Sarah Lee jump on that one, but we also have, this side of the table has been waiting very patiently.
Bliss said something that, I mean, maybe I knew, but it kind of hit me, and I'm thinking about where we grow, but when and if you annex into a municipality, NORMA goes away. And there is no minimum standard associated with NORMA.
There's supposed to be, with minimum standards.
Well,
Chapter
NORMA
50.
is a land use designation, and the comprehensive plan of Volusia County only applies in the unincorporated Volusia County. So if it's zoned industrial in the county and it annexes, the city can give it its own thing, right? So no comp plan policies survive annexation. ECO, though, was intended to survive annexation, and there are portions of ECO within cities. And so in theory, if there's a parcel that is in ECO now in unincorporated county, if it annexes, it retains that ECO designation. There's no enforcement necessarily of that.
Yeah, so just for whoever keeps track of comments, at some point in our life as a committee, we have got to talk about enforcement, but not today. But so is there any minimum standard that has been developed for either ECO and/or NORMA that outlives whether it's in the unincorporated? A minimum standard that we adopt according to our charter is supposed to cross boundaries. Doesn't matter whether it's in a city, doesn't matter whether it's in the county. Do we have anything to date that is considered a minimum standard that helps to implement the objectives of the land use categories, NORMA and/or ECO?
No, we just have our minimum standard of a 25-foot buffer. Yeah.
Okay, so as a food for thought, in my mind, the cities are where we're supposed to grow. The center of the county, other than Farmington, and these big 5-acre, 10-acre things, that's not where I envision urban, suburban development. But if, again, if we're going to be talking about some sort of change in standards, that is important to an ECO and/or a NORMA and/or an OFW, then we need to be thinking about a minimum standard. Or I'm failing to see a purpose, quite frankly.
Okay, I am going to ping pong over to this side, Wendy. Then I'll ping pong back here and then.
Okay, so I'm trying to organize my thoughts about this because with all the ping-ponging, I have like 18 things I want to respond to, but I'm going to start with the original. A couple of months ago, I posed a somewhat coarse idea that Tyler then fine-tuned the rhetoric on about considering buffers based on vertical rise versus horizontal buffers, and to take a side note for a second, it really still bothers me deeply that we have separate ordinances for wetlands protection versus stormwater mitigation, because in my head, those are intricately linked. And so I wonder if there's a way that we can think about a wetland, and you say they're already defined and designated, whatever, is there a way that we can say this wetland is protected based on how far the water spreads out after a fill in the blank inch rain, after a 5-inch rain or a 10-inch rain or a 100-year storm rain or whatever, that we know this wetland fills up to this area because it holds stormwater. That to me just makes a lot of sense. And related to that, our isolated, perhaps even low-quality wetlands inside our urban zones are providing critical stormwater mitigation and helping prevent the flooding of already built properties. And so I would say those are the areas that we need to protect more than anything for the purpose of protecting the infrastructure we've already invested in. And so I would just like us to think about not just a single number for the buffer, and I know that's the way to simplify it, but, you know, is there a way? I know there's a way with elevation modeling, looking at all the people in the room who do elevation modeling to designate what that buffer needs to be for every designated wetland.
Okay, ponging back over here, I think it was Tyler and then Bliss or Jessica or, and Alex.
Yeah. All right, so I want to start with, a while back, somebody asked, where did we get 25 feet from? The state buffer's 25 feet. Where did we get 50 feet from? We doubled it. These were simple math things that were done in our code. This wasn't like a magical, we pulled it out of a hat. It's consistent with state code. So if, you know, this map I actually want to comment on. If we look at DeLand and DeLeon Springs, the areas that are in white, and we look at the area of Orange City that's in white, those are the big areas that are not in Norma, that are in the county. Most of those are built. There's houses and other things there. So I don't really think we have a lot of vacant land that's not in Norma. So when we talk about increasing regulations for the county, just in the areas that are environmentally sensitive, we're really just talking increasing the regulations in the county. And I feel like it's kind of almost like a double speak, because all of the areas that we wouldn't be increasing the regulations are kind of built out already. You know, certainly it's not all of it, but I think that about 90% of our vacant land is in Norma right now. So that is something that I want to make sure that it's a present thought in everybody's mind, that we build on land. If we restrict our buffer widths to the point that, you know, Edgewater, we have some subdivisions we're designing, there's finger wetlands that come in and there's finger ridges, and we can build on the ridges and we're not impacting the wetlands. And with a 25-foot buffer, we can fit our footprint with very minimal impact to the wetlands or buffers, and have some pretty nice subdivisions that all of the houses have conservation land between them. And when they're designed correctly, all the stormwater comes to the middle, it's preserved, that they sell for a lot of money, it provides a nice space to live, and we still have wildlife habitat and connectivity and other things. If we go above a 25-foot buffer to say a 100-foot buffer, development's dead. The whole site, it's either full impact of all those buffers, or you move on from the site. So I think just the nature, the Edgewater Preserve, if you look at Edgewater Preserve, and it's just south of the block of Florida Shores that is, you know, most of Edgewater's residential. And so there's challenges that come from this that are unique, just because our wetlands aren't just like a swamp area that it's just a big glob. There's fingers and other shapes. And like what Bill brought up earlier with a ditch, we cut a ditch in, it doesn't get touched for 50 years, it naturalizes, and now we have a 300-foot wide protected path through the middle of a piece of property if we have a 150-foot buffer on it, or, you know. So I have concerns with the unintended consequences that come from creating code that is inconsistent with other codes. So when we looked at the county chart, Alachua was pretty far out there. I imagine that's because UF has a lot of influence, and UF is who's doing these studies that are suggesting we need wider buffers. I didn't see a lot of other counties that, I don't see the counties that are real out of line with where our code is today. So I have a lot of hesitancy to be a leader and to find out what's going to come badly out of it from that perspective. So Yeah, I'm curious what Lake Marion and the other counties that are in our surroundings, what does Flagler have? I mean, I'd like to try to be consistent. If we're below their standards, then it, you know, yeah, I think it would be reasonable to raise, but I don't think we are. I'd also like in this, if we notice there's a column for mitigation of buffer impacts. It's kind of cut off on the right-hand side of the screen, but there's only 2 counties on this list that are currently requiring mitigation for buffer impacts. So all of the conversation that was back and forth with Bob and Keith and Ginger talking about that, I just want to point out that if we were in, say, Seminole County, state doesn't require us to permit those impacts. Seminole County doesn't require us to permit those impacts. So if I'm, you know, looking at where I want to build something, that's something that's going to be in my mind. So the leading, obviously Alachua County has made some of these steps. Have there been any legal challenges, or is there any precedent of pushback of this being an effective taking of upland that would otherwise be developable? And let's see, where's the rest of my notes here? Oh, Wendy, to the point of wetlands in urban areas, if we dig them deeper, they do more for flood control, but if they're protected, we have to mitigate them with something elsewhere to dig them deeper. So if we fill them in, it makes it worse. Like there's both actions that can happen, but once again, there are engineering solutions that are sometimes superior to the natural wetlands for flood prevention, and it's how our subdivisions aren't flooding when we have the new subdivisions. I know there are examples of poor engineering out there as well. So I think that's kind of all the points that I had in my notes here.
Okay, coming back, Bliss, then we'll go to Alex, then to Jessica.
Thank you. So if we went back to the map, Keith, you were saying that we've already designated the areas where we want to grow. So I'm looking at southeast Volusia, all the way down to the county line. Are you telling me we aren't growing down there?
Well, I mean, you have vested rights. I mean, we've discussed that before. If you have a piece of land and it's a vested parcel, you have the right. I mean, you can consider that growth, I guess. When I was saying growth, I was mainly discussing like changes of land use, large subdivisions, you know, those types of things. I guess it depends on your definition of growth.
All right. Well, this committee focuses on residential. I'm going to focus on industrial. And southeast Volusia is the closest area to the Cape. It has that large swath of Norma, at which nobody was down there. There's not a lot of population, so we just painted it with Norma. There is some eco, but most of it's Norma, unless I have the map confused. And there's lots of landowners that may want to do something with their land as an industrial, development. Because like I said, it's the closest to the Cape. The geographical location is very important, and that growth in between now and 2030, the potential is huge. Brevard County, we didn't compare anything to Brevard County. And typically, when people aren't happy in Volusia County, where do they go? Brevard County, Seminole County. So we can continue to, have burdensome avoidance language, et cetera, regulations, and we can watch our neighboring counties benefit by getting all of the industry. And we've been talking as a county for several years, and it's my understanding that the county council wants us to diversify our tax base. Well, we're taking out a large swath of land. And if you look at the industrially zoned lands available, they aren't close to the county line. And the closest thing we have is we have a wee bit in like 15, 20 acres in Oak Hill. And then we have the newly announced 83 acres, which is going to be 1 million square feet of industrial space in Edgewater. But then you don't have anything to the county line. And I mean, we're talking 12, 15 miles to the county line where there's nothing but a farm here and a farm there. And I think we're missing the boat if we don't look at it and, there isn't a city to annex it into. So are we going to say we don't want any? Okay, and then you also have to take into account, nobody wants certain types of development in their backyard. So here's a large area of the county where it wouldn't be in your backyard. It would not be in anybody's backyard. And it's prime for development. I think these NORMA regulations will cause people to go to Brevard County and Seminole County. And it is contradictory to our marketing efforts.
Alex.
So, I guess
Microphone.
I kind of have a two-part section here. It's all related, but in my opinion, the NERMA buffer needs to survive that annexation, especially as our cities do grow as we expand. We are annexing that urban-rural edge, and as it relates to kind of the Florida Wildlife Corridor and maintaining even just ecosystem service at the regional, state, and global levels as as that biology moves through Volusia in the center section. If we sacrifice the habitat there and we just accept full upland build out, we will be breaking that corridor. And I guess as that relates to kind of our own personal obligations in obeying federal law, we have the Migratory Birds Treaty Act and the Endangered Species Act and all sorts of other environmental protections about animals and wildlife in general, not just wetlands, that the center portion of Volusia is critical. And if that becomes concrete and houses, we are failing at our jobs there. To kind of talk on Wendy's point on the more frequently flooding areas and the smaller duration storms, that kind of relates to, I guess, your 2-year, 5-year, and 10-year return period storms as it relates to hydrologic modeling and engineering there. Maybe one shift that we need to look at is instead of trying to divert those flooding areas into our stormwater ponds, trying to keep the flooding that is exposed in those models relatively consistent with current condition, and trying to look at those as kind of opportunity zones to bank things like bioswales and green stormwater infrastructure and all the stuff associated with low impact development, instead of trying to move the flooding off of the location and into our stormwater ponds so we can put infrastructure there, maybe try to approach it differently. And I welcome your input there. But I think if we start trying to, I guess, make the argument of getting rid of buffers in the center portions, or minimizing them, or walking away from them in some way, we are kind of sacrificing that wildlife corridor connection there that we're looking to maintain. But with the kind of wetland, expanding habitat protections a little bit upslope, if we look at those kind of smaller duration events as opportunity zones for interesting stormwater management, I think we may get somewhere. But
Jessica?
I had a few questions first. On the buffers first, in the chart, it says our maximum is 50. And that's the maximum minimum, right? Because in that OCR, it's like an average 100. Is that? Okay. Right. Okay. And so that concept, the minimum 50, average whatever, might be something that would be interesting to see.
It's also very hard to
Apply.
enforce and apply. Mallory and I were working on one of those projects, and the entire thing was fingers, and it pretty much, she was like, how do I even do this? And I was like, I don't know, you're supposed to tell me, you're the consultant. But it was difficult. We worked through it together, but I think the people who were kind of thinking of that were thinking that wetlands are in linear lines and not all throughout the property like this, because it's very difficult when you're trying to fit a subdivision or a commercial development, and take up all that available space and still meet your minimums and maximums.
Buffer requirements, got it. Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think the general concept of averaging is helpful in some sites to have you can go out here, but up here, but I see the finger wetlands are the issue for the day. That's we don't have a different fee for buffer impacts versus general wetland impacts, right? It's just one overall mitigation fee.
Per square foot, is that what you're saying? Yeah, it is.
It works, yeah. We all got it. Wonderful. I don't think you can. You can't turn off the national alerts. Yeah.
It's raining, it's storing
Yeah.
into land, I guess.
We also have an update on that. Last time
One more time.
we had we had told everyone that the per square foot fee was $1.37, and they have since revised our fee schedule, and we're now to round to the nearest whole dollar, so it went back down to $1 for a maximum. So
Okay. And what made us go back down?
policy.
There was a legal interpretation about the rounding policy, and it's a bit, and if we do anything with this group or any other, updates, we can change that, but however it was adopted, the mitigation fee was adopted, is how we have to round or not round. So anytime we do a fee update, we just need to fix that, but until we fix it, we have to round.
And I think before we started ping-ponging, I was going to say it may be good for us because we're back in my favorite realm of ENRAC, which is theoretical concepts, which is great, and that's what we're here for. But in terms of providing deliverables, I was going to say it may be, and we touched on this, worth going through the avoidance and minimization before we talk about buffer widths to say, here's the line of when you can impact or not, and then if you can't, how far away do you have to be? But since we're still talking about buffers, I think there may be some worth in looking at, and we've heard a little bit today about industrial and things like that, looking at buffers in terms of maybe the the underlying zoning classifications or the use types, because if you look at agricultural or industrial, what I call higher risk activities where maybe you want more of a buffer from sensitive areas versus one single family home, maybe you don't have as much concern. That gets into, I think, the opposite of Bliss's point on economic development. But I also think that NORMA, and correct me if I'm wrong, is intended to mimic the natural resources in the county. It's supposed to be in the general location of where the wetlands and natural, areas are. And so if your property is all wetlands, your property is all wetlands. That is what it is. I think that's where the provisions about adjusting NORMA and ground truthing it to show where the actual wetland lines are so that you do have developable areas makes sense. So we're looking at the maps, but the clicking is back. We're looking at the maps, but in a practical sense, we know that those can be adjusted to show true conditions. And so I think that's an important part of it.
Yes.
Were you not wanting to say my name, Melissa?
No, I was going to call you Bob, but I was thinking like, nothing. Go on.
To kind of go back to, where Keith and I were a while ago, I'm very familiar with the our land use map, in the future, land use, zoning regulations, everything that plays a role in this. And I've been pulling permits and building houses, nothing on the commercial side, for 30 or 40 years in Volusia County. And it doesn't matter where I've built or where I have tried to develop, the regulations are pretty much always the same. And I guess the point I was trying to make is if we're ever going to densify the areas that we've already destroyed, we're going to have two different sets of regulations. There's going to have to be two different lines here. So, I'm not going to get into buffer sizes, retention quantities needed, how we're going to filter the water. The bottom line is, a really simple way of doing this, and I proposed this a long, long time ago, and Dale Arrington was all over it, let's take a compass and stick it in the middle of the land and draw a 3-mile circle around it, and we don't get to build outside of there until we fill that up. And then we'll do a 5-mile circle, and then we can't do exactly that, but we can apply that concept and encourage growth in the areas that have all of the infrastructure there. They've got fire, they've got emergency service. And in the process, we are minimizing and accomplishing the goal of saving large swaths of our beautiful county. That's my view from 30,000 feet, and it hasn't changed.
Okay, our Bill.
I would like to respond a couple of things. First of all, back to the table about the minimum buffer widths. If you look at those, most of them are actually 30, 25, 35, 30, 50, 15, 15. Those are very consistent, pretty much, except for 50 with the widening and our current 25-foot buffers. So it's not like, okay, so we'll leave that there. The one on the last one is 150, is that just for certain? Yeah, that's okay. And then the other one that's 500 feet on 3 rivers, that's just specific areas. Otherwise, it's consistent with the current water management district norms. And then if you go to the map that we were talking about, that Melissa was pointing out, you really don't have much, back to Bob's point about focusing development in places where we want it to be. You go back down to Oak Hill where we were, and what's the red, is that Nerman? The red is okay, so, yeah, so zoom into Oak Hill. It's true, you have hardly any, you've got all the white to deal with. The rest of that is that Nerma or Pico. The darker yellow is Pico, the light yellow is Nerma. So we already have rules in place that are restricting growth in those areas. We already have 50-foot buffers. You don't get much, and to change the land use under that, it would be pretty difficult. So those areas are protected, and you are constrained to only be in the white areas. So we are now proposing to, environmentalists, proposing to increase buffers for wetlands in the white from 20
No,
to
no,
50.
no. Excuse,
The normal buffer, I thought that's what,
no.
This is the PowerPoint that we showed at the very beginning, and it has what we, what could be. I mean, this is we just gave you options, and it's up to you guys to discuss them and pick the options or tell us what you want.
Excuse me for interrupting a second, but a number of people around the table, two things. And Bill, you were going there as well, I think. We can talk about the geographic designations and what we do in those geographic designations. You've said it, Sarah Lee, you said it, Bob, you said it, Tyler. Everybody has sort of said that. And then Jessica brought up, do we talk about the avoidance and the minimization of these areas and then come back and look at the buffer widths? I did not mean to kick off a buffer discussion at the beginning. It's just that was what the documents we got talked about. So if there is agreement around the table, I don't know that there is, but we could pause a moment and ask if there is agreement around the table to approach this. It even was laid out by staff, and we've kind of come around to it as well, as looking at the geographic designation areas and not just an across the board. I mean, I happen to philosophically agree with what Bob said. Let's encourage growth in areas where it's happening and minimize elsewhere. No?
And then if Norma, and ECO already have protections, maybe we can increase it to 75 from 50. But maybe we don't need to. I do like the idea of looking at the underlying zoning to determine if you're going to increase it. NERMA includes a lot of uplands too. It's not all wetlands. There's a lot of forest land out there. And averaging is not that hard to do. You just, if in the way the Water Management District does it, if you have a 25-foot average, 15-foot minimum, you're allowed to go to the 15-foot. Once you go past that, you have to do a secondary impact and mitigate for it into the wetland. But the average, you just show a wider buffer somewhere else that takes up your average or gives you back the average of the 25-foot upland buffer. So averaging is not something that's impossible to do. And I do think we should talk about avoidance minimization, because what you don't realize is that once you allow avoidance minimization and you put that into their hands, it's going to be very rigid. It's very difficult to get past that avoidance minimization argument.
Yeah. 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 I hear it. I would just say we already have avoidance and minimization, and it's a great tool.
Alex.
To expand a little bit on what Bob had said about the compass and kind of concentric circles around the land, I think that is a very intelligent idea to start with. I think it could definitely be modified a little bit, and I think the Lugia even has some components of that a little bit embedded right now. There's a comp plan element that refers to transfer development rights, and that hasn't really been explored or expanded too much in Volusia's history, in my knowledge there. But maybe through a TDR program, we could like incentivize or put multipliers on downtown redevelopment districts and community redevelopment areas, all the HUD overlays and whatever kind of growth incentivizing that we want to do. Kind of put those density multipliers in those zones where, like a TDR program that purchases, you get this kind of free market influence even. But like, let's say you purchase your development right off of, or somebody's development right off of property in central Volusia, You're buying maybe 1 unit per acre or something like that, whatever's embedded in their current land use or zoning and future land use regulations there. But you buy that, and that maybe is received in downtown DeLand, and because it falls underneath a certain density overlay thing that downtown DeLand has, that 1 unit becomes 10. And that's an incentive for the builders. That's a wonderful incentive. I can now stack in as many houses as I can buy off of everybody else. And it kind of incentivizes the conservation of the kind of NERMA eco wildlife corridor area. And then it kind of allows that free market mitigation credit idea to play in a little bit. I guess I do have a question to staff. What is your experience with TDRs in Volusia, and how has that worked in the past? Can you give us any kind of insight there?
It hasn't been implemented in any big way. There was certainly some talk about it during the Smart Growth Implementation Committee meetings, and there was a little bit of that internally in like the Farmton local plan, where density was moved from areas and, but internal to that.
Good. What did you just do? You know what you just did?
Yeah, keep doing that. Yeah. There was a period of time where the county and the municipalities were looking at urban growth boundaries. It died a fiery death, probably around 2005 or 2006, something like that. Yeah. The stress might have contributed. There certainly have been things like that have happened in the past. That's a bigger conversation that involves the cities and the county, obviously. A lot of it was centered around the growth of the city of Deltona and encroaching into some of the more rural areas. It was fairly contentious. But the TDR concept itself hasn't really been implemented, and it's not to say that it couldn't. There certainly is a bureaucracy that would be involved in tracking the, units and that kind of thing, but.
That's not something that we could really do.
No, other than, if you wanted to make a recommendation that, that would require the planners, not just the environmental people.
I just wanted to bring up this map and a point, because I keep hearing about like this area down here, we're talking about, well, we could grow here. This is a map of all the conservation easements and conservation lands. As you can see here, we're talking about moving outside of those cities and having these loops and growing. This whole area is going to be limited to what you can do. I mean, there's conservation lands and conservation easements all throughout the center of that county, and we're going to be adding to that. So keep that in mind when you're talking about growing outside those areas.
Which color is which?
Well, I'm colorblind.
Oh, yeah.
I'm colorblind, so I will scroll up here, and you can tell me.
The green is the conservation easements, or conservation lands, so those are purchased, and then that like brown, orange color are easements.
And the white?
Not encumbered by a conservation easement or owned as a
And that-
conservation land. It's privately owned.
And that's not the city's.
Gross land area, that is?
It's over 30%
Yeah.
of the county is in
Yeah.
some sort of permanent conservation.
And then you add your city, and town layers to that. You even have less area that's in an incorporated county. And then you add, your NORMA areas, you add your RC, your ESCs. We're running out of developable land, without land use changes and major changes to the code.
What is that percentage of all those combined?
Oh, yeah, it's a little bit dated, but we did
Yeah.
do that work.
We did do that, and I actually had our summer intern last summer go through and tally the state lands county lands, federal lands, the mitigation banks, and the conservation easements. Correct. And it is right at about 32.6% of the county. So it's almost a third of our county is conserved in one form or another, which.
Is that all of the county, including cities, or just unincorporated?
All of it, yeah. And I've got a great spreadsheet for it.
What about adding NERMA and ECO?
No, that's not included. It's just those that were conserved in perpetuity. Yeah. It didn't look at land use or zoning.
So we should be really proud of ourselves for the wonderful job we've
Yes,
done
we should.
farming land.
We should, yes.
Now let's get busy figuring out how we're going to easily develop the rest of it.
Not the rest
Yeah.
of it.
This is the point,
I'll make a deal right here. We're real simple. We just want to develop 50% of the rest of it.
The cities have that. I mean, when something that's getting lost is our rural areas in our farmlands. I mean, I grew up in a rural area, and I mean, a lot of the rural areas don't want that growth. They want to remain rural.
But that's ECO and NERMA and ESC.
A lot of it is in eco and norma, yes.
And you're not developing ECO, NORMA, or ESC, right?
Well, I mean, people, yeah, you can have conservation subdivisions, right? You can do that. You can change your land use. You could.
One in how many years?
Well, none have been approved. Farmington,
Thank you. Farmington is hundreds of acres, and I forget the percentage of the land that was put in conservation. They're going to have houses, they're going to have commercial centers, and they're going to have industrial. And look how far it goes. But that was a long, hard fight, millions of dollars, years and years of fight. And that was a private landowner who had nothing but ag land, and they wanted to do something with it. So I'm using that as an example of other farm ag land in southeast Volusia, that who knows, somebody might want to do something with. And it is in the close proximity to the Cape. It can be a job generator. It doesn't have to be residential. I'm just saying we need to be more balanced and open-minded.
But it would need to go through a process similar to what Farmington had to do.
Right, because Farmington was in Norma,
Because Farmington wasn't.
but as part of their local plan, they internally transferred development rights. So they extinguished development rights on about 60% of the property. They moved those units, and they have non-residential density as well, and clustered it, and they were able to do that through a process. But they have Norma too. So I guess what my point is, that doesn't preclude someone else from doing the same thing. What Farmington had that a lot of folks don't is lots of contiguous land, right? That was what they had going for them, but there's nothing that precludes someone else from doing that if they have the land and the, desire to do all those things.
Okay, but as a couple people have already pointed out, there are uplands within Norma,
Of course.
which
Yes.
now we're saying they can't be developed.
No, we're not saying that.
no.
Okay, let me put it this way. And this is when I was going to save this for the avoidance language conversation. You have 3 parcels in a row, for an example. And the middle parcel is uplands. Your parcels on either side are wetlands. You add your wetland buffers, you've eliminated the use of the upland parcel in the middle because of your buffers. Depends on, but if you expand the buffers, which is not going to be popular, but I believe that the St. John's buffer of 25 is just fine.
Well, you still have to look at whatever that land use and zoning is on that piece of property. You still have property rights, whatever is permitted, a permitted use on the property. Like Keith and Ginger have been saying, is that just because the buffers are there does not mean that you can't permit the impacts to the buffer. So it just depends on the use you're proposing, if it's, permitted within that zoning classification and land use. And if that's the only way you can fit it on there, then it's gonna get permitted. So it doesn't negate development, just negates how you develop.
In today's market-ready market, your land has to be market-ready. People are not going to come in, okay, so the developer, like Farmton, they have spent years getting this property ready for development. If somebody else is going to make their land market-ready, that means when a company is identified and comes here, they can be up and operating within 13 months. This process takes years, and they're going to go somewhere else.
Would anyone like to take a quick break and come back? Okay, let's try to do 10 minutes.
Isn't it only 3 hours in the county lot? 3 hours.
What law?
The county lot,
Ding, 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 ding. I need one of those nice bells. Boom, boom, boom. And I think I gave you 15. Okay, where were we? People had their, okay, Jessica, Wendy, Bliss had things they wanted to say.
I did, what were they? Just kidding. Mine was on, when we talk about avoidance and minimization, and mostly this was to Alex's point on the transfer development rights, because I love that concept. I think it's amazing and I think it's underutilized. Is that when we talk about buffers, I think that one, a pet peeve of mine is that the conservation and subdivision provisions of the code as written don't allow you to transfer density from the wetland areas if it's a conservation subdivision, but it does if it's a cluster subdivision under the code. And so allowing for transfers of density from the wetland areas would be interesting. And maybe extending that out to buffers would also kind of compensate for the increased protections if we're looking at that.
So yes, and I want to agree, again, going back to your 3-mile compass, because it's creating an interesting anchor point for conversation. And I agree with the concept, but as I was saying earlier, I think urban green space is absolutely essential, whether that's city parks, linear green spaces like bike trails and walking paths, and the things that actually contribute to quality of life for the people who live in those communities. I don't think anybody in any of our Volusia communities want to live in an entirely concrete, brick, asphalt landscape. We want our urban green spaces. And so I would say, get that density in there, maximize your density, whatever tools you have to maximize your density, build up as often as you can build up, cluster as often as you can cluster, give incentives for people to do that so you can save the urban green space as well that contributes to the quality of life of all the people who live in there. What that has to do with buffers or avoidance, I don't know, but the more we can build up and protect our spaces, not just over there in the Palmetto Curtain, but within our own communities, I think it's better for our own health and well-being.
I just want to add in with the transfer development rights concept, the purchasing or kind of that transfer, I'd like that to not just be limited to the land that is being developed and enable, let's say, the 25 neighbors in the area to sell off some of their rights, and kind of maybe that becomes a community buy-in measure where if a developer proposes a community that exceeds the density requirements, if they can have 75 people sell them development rights, that's 75 people that say, yes, I want this community right next door. So I think that could be tied in a little bit as well, but I don't want it to just be kind of looked at as another way to extract density out of preserving a wetland system that's already relatively preserved.
Where would you like to go now? Yeah, and I think that is what was point 2, continuation committee review and provide comments on page 3 of staff distributed document, or no?
Yes, or you had asked that we, based on the discussion last time, come up with actual language for avoidance and
Yes.
minimization. And so we have that document as a, a starting point.
Is that the one titled avoidance language in our packet?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
No, it's not. Somewhere else. Hold on. I gotta find it again.
It's not that Word document.
Okay, so I'm going to start, but Keith and the team really are the ones that worked on this since the last meeting. But just to set the stage a little bit. So we used the format of the ordinance, the implementing ordinance, Chapter 72, as it exists right now. As decisions or recommendations get made by this group and you know, hopefully to the county council for discussion, you know, one of the things we've talked about is changing the sections that we have, right, and reordering them and making them make more sense. For this discussion, we left the sections the way that they are and put, you know, placeholder language. If in fact we agree on some of this language, it might not actually look like this. Like, for instance, it might not be letter J in the final product, right? So just with that understanding that it made the most sense to use what we had for discussion purposes, might look different by the end, so.
So everybody received this, so basically, I added things to the code that we had discussed in the last meeting. You know, we're looking for direction on what you want us to keep in or take out. We have some of the, we have alternatives here, and yeah. So what alternative A would be the most restrictive language that we're discussing. So it'd be like anything that's within the natural resource management area or environmental core overlay shall avoid adverse impacts to wetlands and they're basically their buffers. So that would be any new impact, basically, for any project. Yeah.
What does it say today? I thought it said something.
Yeah. And then alternative B would be basically, alternative A would basically affect even lots with vested rights. And that's like the most extreme, strict interpretation. Alternative B would be applied to density or intensity changes, subdivisions, rezonings, and changes to the future land use. This language is consistent with the language in NORMA, and this is just how are we going to apply that language.
I'm going to say, is this proposed changes or this is just the current application interpretation?
Yeah, so let's help you out a little bit. So the document that you have, anything that's just black, right, black text is what exists. There are some places where there's some green text. That is language that does not exist today and is here for discussion. In some cases, like Keith was just saying for number 14, there's more than one choice, right? So we wrote in a couple of our alternatives. One exception to that sort of black and green thing is that number 10 here, additional language is here in the highlighted area with underline. So remember last time we looked at the comp plan and we talked about making the avoidance language in the code consistent with what's in the comp plan. And we talked a little bit about how the comp plan, in most of the county, it talks about reasonable use of the property. In NORMA, the avoidance criteria in the comp plan is a little bit more strict. So we tried to bring that in. So number 10 is that, right? So this is when somebody brings in their application and we're looking at that application and we're looking at these standards for review. What it says now is that first sentence, whether the proposed project has to be in the wetland, et cetera. And then this last sentence is adding in that comp plan clarity, right? So it's only allow for reasonable use of the property for its primary purpose under the existing future land use category, right? So that's saying what you have is what you have, and you can have wetland impacts to get reasonable use of that property. Right, or if you're zoned industrial and you're putting in an industrial development, avoidance and minimization would be based on reasonable use of that property for the use that it's intended. The second added sentence there, we also talked about quite a bit last time, is about accessory structures and those sorts of things, right? And so basically what we're trying to say there, and we could frankly use some help, not just with the concept, but with the language, because we internally weren't sure that this was written very well. But anyway, so impacts to wetlands or buffers for those ancillary uses, including structures, may not actually meet those avoidance and minimization criteria, right? So I used the word may. I think what I really mean is might. Like, you might not be able to get a pool. It might not meet avoidance criteria. You might not get a shed, right? So I'm not sure that that word actually, I'm not sure we wrote it right. But that was what you guys talked about last time, was if that shed or whatever accessory structure has to be in the buffer, that you might not get that thing because it doesn't meet avoidance and minimization. So that's for discussion. And then as you go down where Keith was talking about 14, again, green is language for consideration, and where we didn't have any consensus last time, we put in alternatives. And in each case, we put in a very strict alternative and then, one or two sort of less strict alternatives for discussion.
For that last sentence, could you say something like, if ancillary uses, including accessory structures, impact wetlands or buffers, they may not be permitted. They may not be permitted. I mean.
Right. Yeah. I think we could.
Yeah.
If we agreed on the concept, we could figure out the language with this group and with the attorneys and all of that. We tried to throw it out on the paper. So, yeah, I think that would work. Right.
First, Tyler?
Okay, so I think one of my questions actually is, can we build a fence? What happens if I build a fence? So I can fence in my backyard. I can cut off the wetland from wildlife with my privacy fence, but I can't put a shed in. Kind of doesn't make any sense at all to me, as just like at a common sense level.
Well, typically, what we do with fences is barbed wire and cattle fencing is, typically, it allows for passage of water and wildlife. That's different than putting in a wall or putting in a privacy fence. It may not meet avoidance minimization to put a privacy wall or a vinyl face wall in that area. So, you may have a partial vinyl and then the rest of it.
Are you guys part of the fence permit review process?
Yes.
You are? Okay. So a fence could be restricted. However, I still see this as a situation where if my backyard isn't wetland, if it's upland, I want to fence it in so I can let my dog out. I don't have to walk my dog on a leash. That's all okay, but I can't stick a shed there. As a citizen, I can't see that being something that flies very well, which is who county council answers to. So I'm just kind of also looking at it as we're the citizen advisory committee.
Typically, fences don't require building pads, fill, the removal of native vegetation. Usually, you can just, hand clear an area, put your fence in. That's different than coming back there and putting fill, removing native vegetation, impacting the buffer when you have other suitable locations on the property.
I mean, but what we're saying is that it just may not be allowed. It's not saying if there's another suitable location, you'll be forced to put it there. It's saying that if there's not another suitable location, it won't be allowed. You guys have previously said that you'll disallow pools and sheds and other structures. And what I'm saying is that I think that somebody that buys a house, that because of a wetland buffer that extends onto their property, if it were to prohibit that use, I don't know, I think it's reasonable for them to be upset.
So it actually states that lower in the document. It says where proposed development cannot be located on an upland portion of the parcel or contiguous parcels under common ownership.
Okay, well, the added language then, like what Wendy was wordsmithing is what I'm talking about, it was the last.
Yeah, we could add that as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's what Ginger was saying, between the may and the might, to kind of, clarify what the intent was.
See, they got a great idea down in Amazon because they get so much water change. They put them on stilts. So why couldn't you put an ancillary structure off the ground?
It shades the ground and kills the vegetation underneath and takes away wildlife habitat, even though they could have refuge under there. Same as a dock. You never see fish under docks. That's why we permit.
I've seen those signs on the islands, no fish allowed.
Bill?
No, that's a good question, and on stilts, it's still considered a complete impact. On, above, or underneath a wetland, it's an impact. So what's happening here is they already have avoidance minimization language, but they're boxing it in so that it's going to be very difficult. Option number A says you have to have overriding public interest, which no development really, unless it's a school or maybe a road, will have a public interest. These are just boxing in completely. Already, if you do have avoidance minimization and you do use it, and it actually makes people want to annex out of the county into adjacent cities where they don't drive avoidance minimization as much. But now we're talking about increasing the avoidance minimization to a place where they're actually looking at it. We had one up in Flagler County where DEP thought it was an ERP, but it was really a 404 permit, and they were talking about avoidance minimization, so you had to change the size of your pool. This person had ADA requirements, they were going to have people come out in wheelchairs. So we were actually talking about the design of this house. No, you can only have 8 foot of a patio around your pool instead of 12 feet because they can still get around. And ultimately, the client ended up going 3 stories and adding in elevators just to get past this avoidance minimization with this one agency person who was saying, no, you can't avoid minimizing.
The language about demonstrating the override public interest is already in the comprehensive plan. So, we just, making this consistent with the language that we already have. And this is just for, again, this is for NORMA and the eco overlays. So we're not talking about all areas. It's.
And then when we talk about adding buffers, now you're actually making it even more. So this is a step-by-step process to impact this. Oops.
Wendy?
I would just add to both Tyler and Bill that land buyers should beware. They should know the rules and not be expecting to put ancillary structures in wetlands that are on property that they buy.
The concept of caveat emptor was eliminated about 2 decades ago in Florida.
So we have a project recently that we killed because it's in NORMA, and we advised that the landowner sell the parcel and get his money back out of it. There's a wetland formed adjacent to the DOT ditch. It is naturalized into the property at a decent distance. There's nowhere for us to put a driveway into the property. There's 100 acres of wetland behind it, but what's my overriding interest? That language is why we won't move forward with the project. So it is happening, and that was going to be a 10-acre lot subdivision. It wasn't going to be an excessively damaging project. It was going to be dirt road subdivision. And we can't move forward because we have to go across 100 feet of wetlands, and the language is that strict. And the client, I was not the environmental representative on it, but the client was advised by the environmental representative that this is probably not the path you want to go. So, you know, what we're talking about, we're not just trying to be like scaremongers. This is literally happening to us on a daily basis where the unintended consequences of these protections, I mean, how do you build a driveway? How do you get a road in if the whole front of your site is wet and then you have the dry land behind it? No, it says that you can't touch the wetland unless it has an overriding public interest.
Well,
that's what the code says.
That's,
Well, this is not code, this green is not in the code right now.
In the NORMA section, in the NORMA overlay, it specifically has the words overriding public interest.
Right, in the comprehensive plan, and so we're trying to make it consistent. The issue is the way the comprehensive plan is written is that any impact to any wetland in NORMA would require overriding public interest. So we wanted to put a couple of alternatives here to talk about because that is a very strict standard. So alternative A is the literal interpretation of what the comp plan says. Alternative B here is
Metal water bottle?
I've had it here. Alternative B is saying that overriding public interest would come into play when you're changing the density or intensity of a parcel. So if you have a parcel and you're developing it by the vested rights that you have, then, you know, the normal avoidance and minimization criteria would come into play. But if you're asking for increases in density or intensity or a rezoning or whatever, then the overriding public interest would come into play. So that's a little bit less strict interpretation of what the comp plan says, so that's an alternative. You know, the other alternative is that you could all agree that the comp plan language isn't good, and that's a different, you know, thing that we would have to address with comp plan. In most situations where, and there's some language in the conservation subdivision ordinance that talks about no wetland impacts if you're going to do the conservation subdivision, but we did add, originally it said no wetland impacts. We added some language that said except for like a utility crossing or access, right? And so I think that's reasonable to say if the thing that's preventing you from getting to the developable portion is a wetland impact at your driveway, that's a reasonable thing to permit, right? And so we could write it in that way. So I don't know in the case that you're talking about, if you ever came to us looking for a permit, because that sounds like something we would have permitted.
It was all pre-permit discussion points. In this case, we looked at the conservation subdivision. That was an avenue that was explored, and it was deemed financially not worthwhile because in a conservation subdivision, so if you take 100 acres, you split it into 10-acre tracts, you get 9 or 10 10-acre parcels. So when you sell a 10-acre parcel, you're selling somebody 10 acres of land. You take 10 times however much each acre's worth. Conservation subdivision, okay, I can put in 1 acre, 2 acre, you know, whatever little tiny parcels comparatively. But then when I go to sell that to somebody and I have 50 acres in conservation, I'm not selling the 50 acres. So I take 50 times 0, and then I have to get way more per acre than what the land is worth in the area that subdivision goes in. So economically, numbers don't work. They don't move forward with the project. So the only way we could conceivably, you know, as a team, see it getting permitted was through processes that were not viable and achieved 1 and 2 acre lots in a rural area where nobody wants that. And so literally the incentivization of cluster subdivisions, I mean, a 1/4 acre lot traditionally was 75 by 145, and then we took 25 feet off the front for the road. That's our 1/4 acre lot subdivision, 75 foot wide. They're all now 40 and 50 foot in a cluster subdivision because that's how you get your density. Everybody hates that because you don't have any green space around you. So we cluster the green space. That's what's being argued for here today, is that we need to increase the density of our units. I don't personally like it. I think 75 foot minimum lot width is a good thing where you have a little green space around you, and then you don't have an open park that can later be turned into a building. You know, it's harder to stick houses between houses, but in the situation that we had, it's, again, the code is driven towards the conservation subdivision to incentivize density in a space where you don't want density. But it's because of you can't alter wetlands. It's at their discretion, and so basically you put everything in public record, go forward and roll the dice on whether or not the client gets what they want, and if they pull the plug, as the professional, I still don't make money, so.
So as Ginger said, alternative A was presenting the issue you were having with not being able to put the driveway over the wetland. And B says that that would only kick in if you're asking for a change in the underlying use of that land. And then Ginger said if we wanted to, we could also look at the comp plan. Jessica, you wanted to say something.
Trying. Yeah, I think that in drafting the land development regulations, I mean, the comp plan is supposed to be nebulous at some level, right? It's supposed to be flexible so that then the land development regulations can implement it further. I think we could include language that says, for the purposes of this section, utility and access to parcels is deemed to be in the public interest, so that you create those thresholds that are avoiding those issues, so that there's no question, and I see the concern is if staff didn't like a project, I'm not accusing you guys of this, 20 years down the road, different staff. If they don't like a project, they can say, no, sorry, hands are tied. There's nothing we can do about this. Whereas if you have the language, everyone has that expectation, and then the consultants say, here's the rule, here's the provision, we're good to go, and there's no question of that during the kind of due diligence review.
Well, and I just want to point out too, there are standards that exist right now for avoidance and minimization. The staff interprets those, and we do our best to interpret them the same for every person. It's not like we're over here saying, well, Tyler's coming, so we're gonna hit him with the avoidance and minimization. It's not, we can't go rogue over here. I feel like there's some feeling that we're just making shit up as we go, and that's not really the case. And if we were doing that, there's always everything that we say can be appealed to the DRC, every decision of the DRC can be appealed to the council. So it's not like you got a couple people here wearing their little, general hats saying no or yes based on something outside of the code. What we're trying to do today is, we know how we've been interpreting these things over the years. We're trying to put them on paper so that there is even less gray area, and have recommendations that go forward and actually get written in here so that it's easier for everybody to understand what to expect when they get here. So I just wanted to lay that on the table. I was getting a little vibe of we're over here being despots or something, and that's not what we're trying to do.
Not at all what I was meaning to imply. I have never seen you guys approve us touch a wetland in these areas. Every single encounter that we've had, we have been told absolutely hell no. So my experience is very consistent that you apply the avoidance and minimization criteria to the strength of how it's written in A, and every experience that we've had. So.
And this probably goes back to before any of you were on staff, but I avoid wetlands like the plague. Okay? And for the past 15 years, when somebody brings property to me, if it has a little tiny corner of wetlands, I go, nah, done, next. Yeah, no, I don't.
Wendy.
And it's really a nice piece of property.
Just want to add that.
One more thing, though, I'm sorry. All joking aside, I don't have that opinion at all about the staff. One of the things, though, that really happens quite frequently, and Tyler was mentioning it, the regulations are so complex, there are so many of them, that even if I grab 3 or 4 people who are supposed to be experts on them and try to do a pre-analysis before we ever come to you guys, they're just so complex that at the end of the day, the decision will be, yeah, it's a really great project and it could really benefit the whole community, but looks like it's going to be a nightmare. Let's try to find something else. And so I think one of our underlying, objectives here should be, as well as clarifying, simplifying. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
First off, Samantha and I are for hire, and we can. Yeah. No. I'm saying. Yeah. Exactly. Yes. Yeah. To the highest bidder. But yeah, we do impact wetlands in Norma all the time. We're a permit for buffer impacts, wetland impacts. Of course, they have to meet the avoidance minimization, but there are other things at work. Whether this project was in the floodplain, there's an issue to that. Portions of the comp plan don't allow for urban residential development within NORMA, so you have to have that conservation subdivision. And there are exemptions in the conservation subdivisions for impacts to wetlands, for roadways and utility access. I mean, there are ways to do it. It just may not be your preferred way, and it may not be economically viable, but not every property is suitable for development.
And I want to jump in about appeals to the DRC. The appeal process here is very, very simple. You get a no from Keith, and then it's either in your response to comments if it's a large development or if it's on a building permit. All you have to do is fill out this one-page thing for the Land Development Office stating what you're appealing, why you're appealing, your permit number, and then you're put on the next DRC agenda. And the DRC is the Development Review Committee that has 3 department heads that are going to make that decision, right? So that's literally all it is. There's no other paperwork besides that.
Is that how it's always going to be?
What did he do? What did he do? I missed it. Oh. Okay, Bliss.
I was just wondering, when it comes to developing something in Norma, do y'all have a statistics on how many get approved and how many have to go through the first get a no, then go for appeal, and then drag it on out? I mean, because, what's the norm here? Because we have examples of everything, and I'm looking at this avoidance language with the proposed language, and although it is supposed to be to simplify, I find that it is adding additional deterrence and cumbersome language.
Last year, we did around 20,000 reviews and inspections. We had 1 that was denied. And it went to county council. DRC upheld our decision. It went to county council. County council upheld the decision. So, 1 last year. Extremely.
I'd like to chime in as the chairman of the Development Review Committee to kind of let you know what's going on, is that you're hearing from environmental management about wetland standards. Overall, there's multiple layers of different sets of regulations that have to be balanced as we go through it. One of the things that you will continually hear from our legal staff, right, Chris, is the Burt Harris Property Rights Act. So therefore, when we're looking at this, we look at the future land use element and the future land use map, because that dictates what everybody has termed entitlements. These are the basics that every landowner says are my rights to develop, subject to your standards. Then we drill down with the zoning. Zoning, again, I always say is that, land use tells you what, zoning tells you how in regards to setbacks, building coverage, etc. Then you have to get into the nitty-gritty of what's on that site. That's where the balancing again comes out. I would have to say that if you're telling me that you didn't go forward because there was a wetland across the entire front and there was no access to the site, I would say you would have to have been given access, because otherwise you would have no right to use your property. Mm-hmm. And so if you had wound up in front of the DRC, I would think that we probably would have been somewhere in that world. So the fact is, please keep in mind as we're going through these, yes, it's development in the state of Florida is not a simple one-page zoning document that dictates what you can do. There's multiple layers. It's become that way because we've learned from experience about what is happening. The reason why I left is right now there's some legislation that I had to talk to FAC about how they want to make sure building permits are issued within 24 hours of receipt. Or we have 3 calendar days to make a determination. So you submit it on Friday, I have to have staff come in on Saturday and Sunday to do a review. So what you're seeing is that there's this completely integrated effort to try and make sure that we're protecting the private property rights of all property owners and ensuring that the development is going along so that that way it's sustainable and is not going to have any negative impacts on the existing environment or those who are developed ahead of us. So keep that in mind. We agree that we need to simplify this. We need to come up with a way so that that way folks can feel a lot more comfortable as they go forward. As someone who used to do due diligence reports with Bill when I worked at Zev Cohen, I can tell you, we had to come up with multiple iterations for our clients so that they knew how to proceed at this point. There's going to be properties that are not going to be within those developers' realistic expectations. So you wait until the market gets hotter and you can sell it for a little bit more. So again, I just want to make sure, keep in the back of your mind that all of this is a balancing act, and we're really just trying to get to that point of what can we do to ensure that we're protecting the resource without negatively impacting the private property owner's rights to develop. He's got my back.
Jessica. Try and top that, Jessica.
Can't be better than Clay.
Calendar days. I'll give you a copy of the, yes, it is.
Holiday weekend Fridays are going to be busy application days.
I would say, don't tell us that, Clay.
And you'll have staff.
Well, right now, 90% of our building permit applications are online. 90% of our building permit applications are online.
Yep.
So that means a building permit that's submitted at 5:15 on a Friday afternoon, the clock starts ticking. That means with Monday morning, haven't sent them a notice that it's incomplete. It's presumed complete, and we have to.
And as an aside, thinking back to the growth management workshop last year, I think it was, April maybe, there was a nifty little chart about how applications had increased and staffing had not.
That's correct.
So y'all are doing a great job, given that.
You don't want to see what our bill is to Universal Engineering and other private consultants who are having to do plan review and inspections. 6 figures.
So.
Wow, and outside.
And that's with all the cities.
Yeah. Back to wetlands, just a quick thing. So, with this language, and Bliss, I hear your point on complicating and putting up barriers. What I want to say is that this is not a new barrier. What this is doing is telling individuals who don't know to check the land development code and the comprehensive plan and all of these provisions what the rules are. This is already the rule. A is already the rule. Strict, boom, here it is. B, I think if we were to say we adopted B, we'd need a corresponding comprehensive plan amendment update to make it match. Right now it's A, and we can clarify what's in the public interest, what is, kind of counting in there to expand it out. But this isn't a new burden to landowners. This is creating a system where they don't have to hire a land use attorney to say, the engineers looked at the zoning code, they created a plan that's compliant, but this comp plan policy applies and knocks it out. I've had that 3 times in the past week where we've said this will never work. You can't get it approved. It's not that it won't be supportive, it's that it's impossible. And so I like this. It's not creating anything new, it's putting it where everyone can see it. Well, it depends. Right now I like A because that's the rule. If we're saying it should only apply to increased density or things like that that increase the capacity, that's up to the committee to suggest, but right now it's A. With the caveat that I would like to clarify what counts as the public purpose.
Yeah. Yeah.
We came up with some definitions of.
We as a legal.
Yes.
Just to clarify.
We also had to make sure they're appropriate for all the comp plan, because these are terms that are used variably throughout different areas. So that was also a concern.
So I liked your suggestion, Jessica, that if we wanted to do B or something like B, where we said, okay, well, we only really mean it in these cases, we would want to modify the comp plan. And then I liked how you said, and these things, X, Y, Z, are deemed to be in the public interest. So we had talked about utilities and access, right? So if you put that in the actual language, then You don't have to put it in the definition. Right, Chris?
What was that?
Say yes, Chris. If we wanted to say, utilities or, installation, wetland impacts for the installation of utilities or for access to property, roads or whatever, are deemed in the public interest.
Yeah.
We could put that, yeah.
Right there.
We could, yes.
Put it right there, not mess with the whole definition.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One-stop shopping.
And then it would be just for this section. So
Right, for the purposes of this section, yeah. Yeah.
So the Water Management District also has, you can't impact an OFW unless it's in the public interest, not that it's not adverse to the public interest like most wetlands. And so normally that's considered any public project. But recently, we've been working with an attorney out of Tallahassee, and if you treat more stormwater and improve the receiving water body, water quality, then that can be in the public's interest. So we should look at that very closely and make sure we have everything in there. If that's the route.
That would be a different section, or there? Ah.
Treatment.
So we've just had a nice long discussion on 14A or B. We've looked at A and decided to modify definitions of public interest. Bill just brought up another thing to add to that in the definition section. Are we at a decision point on this or not? We're just going to keep.
I think decisions would be great.
That's kind of what I thought. So are we good with the choice between A or B under item 14? Dr. Anderson.
I would make a motion to approve option A because it is consistent with the comp plan.
Any discussion?
Yeah, would that include the modification?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, okay. So the motion by Dr. Anderson was to approve alternative A, 14A, with the inclusion of the modification of what is in the public, what the public interest is, seconded by Jessica? No. Any discussion?
Go ahead.
Okay. I think even with the clarification, this is going to have much further, the interpretation that's being used and matching with the county charter as it's currently written results in a much stronger reduction in the available development of that land, because this is including buffers. This isn't just saying you can't touch the wetland, it's including those 100-foot buffers. I struggle with A. Like, I can't vote yes for A. I will definitely be a no vote for A.
So just to reiterate, A is
Consistent with
what
the charter,
exists.
but not consistent with code presently, and is bringing code consistent with the charter. And I would rather that we, because they've said that they're permitting impacts in wetlands and in buffers that don't have an overriding public interest.
And where are you
So
seeing 100-foot buffers on these?
well, it doesn't say it in this section, it's the norm of buffer. And so I struggle that this is ratcheting the rules further if, they're telling me that they're permitting things today, so that means that they aren't following the county charter today, that they're really following B in this category, and that by voting for A, we would be instituting an increase in regulation. Effectively. Right now, we're just not compliant with our charter.
Comp plan.
Comp plan, excuse me. And I'd rather see the comp plan amendment to be consistent with how we're applying the rule rather than change the rule. just my 2 cents.
Bill?
I agree, and just the fact that the word overriding, that's just even ratcheting up more, makes it more difficult. But yes, I agree. Right now, we're applying one thing, and we're just putting it in writing so that it will be just more rigorous than it is ratcheting up protections. And I would probably not vote for that.
Wendy, then Jessica.
Okay, so I'm just, again, a generalization, but I have seen over and over and over where developers use consistency with the comp plan to justify changes in rules. But when we propose changes in rules to be consistent with the comp plan, then suddenly it's not okay.
Jessica?
Yeah, let me say, I think if the land development code is inconsistent with the comp plan wins all day. That's what controls. It is going to win regardless, that's what should be implemented. I think, and I'll defer to Ginger and Keith, when they say they have been permitting things under this section, they're saying they interpret this language to say that the overriding public interest can include essentials like access and reasonable use of the property. And that is why there are being permits. And so they're operating under this provision today. It is maybe just expanding that clarification we talked about for utilities and access to include kind of more of that information. Because they're not saying they're not applying this, is what I have heard.
Right. We're not saying that we are currently inconsistent with the comp plan in our practice, but we have interpreted that to say if you can't access your property because of this, then, we're allowing impacts that have to happen in order for you to have the use of your property that gets us out of Burt J. Harris. So adding that language and putting in A is not inconsistent with what we're doing now. Does that make sense? Did that come out right? Right, it would actually just solidify what the comp plan says and what we're doing now. But because we are interpreting that, like you have to be able to get to your property, you have to be able to have utilities or whatever, there are impacts happening in Norma. The second one, could be a different, whatever, we could live with that if that's kind of where the committee goes as well, right? If you're just talking about what you have is what you have. If you want more, then the rules.
I'll just remind, we have a motion to approve A. Jessica?
Follow-up question, to play out the what if. We talked about utilities and access. If you have one lot vested that is 98% in Norma, can they build a house?
Well, and in the wetland?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
With this rule?
If it's a single-family lot, and it's all or whatever in Norma, and you have to impact the wetland to build the house, we've been permitting that.
We have a live example called Daytona Park Estates.
Yeah.
Well,
Right, and we talked about that, and so I think that gets to the essential question on, when you read A, the answer in your mind is, no, they can't.
Right.
And so clarifying, maybe we do have to do a comp plan amendment to clarify it too, where it's the overriding public interest or the essential use of the property. It's not accessory and it's not this, but if you have 98% wetland and you have to build a house, that's the essential use of the property and you can do that. And so just kind of adding that clarity.
That's basically B.
Well, B to me, as the sneaky lawyer, reads as, I don't have to worry about Norma if it's already existing, only if I change something. And so I don't know if that's what we want either.
I don't know that I interpret it that way, but I think that leaves you the caveat that you can use it for reasonable use with the definition below that the reasonable use is you get what's vested on the property. If you buy a single-family lot in Norma and it's 100% wetlands, you have a right to build a house on that lot.
But do you have a right to build a pool under B? Because you're not changing the density or intensity. That's
To build a what?
A pool. Our favorite example.
Yeah.
Okay. We had a motion on the floor. If there's no further discussion, it's time to call the vote, I think. Yes? All those in favor of alternative A with the amended language to, Jessica?
Is it, we talked about additional language to clarify the intent. Is that included or no? Okay.
So alternative A with the explanation of what is in the public interest, utilities, access, so that you can utilize your property. Yes? All those in favor? Let's do hands.
That was 6 people.
I got 6, yeah. And those opposed? 5. Motion carries. Okay, we have 16 minutes.
Scroll down.
Shall we at least start the discussion on the next?
Are we just accepting these, it was 10 in addition to underlines? Are we voting on that too, or is that existing?
You did not vote on 10.
We did not vote on 10. We didn't do a motion on 10. That's correct. I would entertain a motion on 10.
In concept, though, not necessarily the way that it's written, right? Because we had talked about, Wendy's version of that last sentence was, if ancillary structures are located in the wetland or buffer, they may not be permitted. It's the may that's the thing, because it's might,
Might.
right? Like, I
Might
don't know.
not be permitted.
Yeah.
Might not be permitted is clearer than might not be avoidance.
Right,
Right.
right.
That's a mouthful that may not be understandable.
That's confusing as heck.
Can't do it.
Well, it sounds like it's done on discretion, and that's not what you want. I mean, if it's a rule, it's a rule. By including might or may in there, I think you need other words. We need more clarity, because it's almost like, well, we're not sure, but, you know, it may not work.
Well, and let me give you an example of like why we didn't want to say necessarily no ancillary structures will ever be permitted in a buffer, right? Because sometimes you have a buffer that's already impacted, like 50 years ago, somebody cleared this buffer, all it is grass, and they want to put a pool deck in it. I mean, are we going to say, no, you can't put a pool deck in a grassed buffer? Maybe not, but if the buffer is fully natural, you're on Spruce Creek, and you have this great, wonderful vegetated buffer, and you want to come and cut it all out and build a pool deck, right? So we didn't necessarily want to say, you shall never have an accessory structure in a buffer. But on the other hand, to lay out there that there are cases where accessory structures are not going to meet avoidance and minimization because the loss of function is so great in that case.
I hear you, but that's not giving it clarity, you know, by saying that. You know, I mean, that makes all the sense in the world, and I think that's reasonable, but it is, you know, there's got to be a better way if you're going to get it down to, you know, to giving people information before they buy property or move forward. That to me is a looseness that it makes it encumbering. So, but with that in mind, I wouldn't want to agree to the language as it exists today.
Yeah, that's a good point. So this could have been, just keeping that language, which I know is a placeholder, you could have stopped at wetland and buffer impacts are only permitted to allow for reasonable use of the property for its primary purpose under the existing future land use, period. But we've said that elsewhere too. Then to me, it's a separate idea. I've got my property, I can put my house on it, it's zoned for a house. If I want to put in a shed or a pool, I have to apply for a permit. Right? Anyway, you're just trying to be nice and give warning that those kinds of...
Right, because that's what we were tasked with doing was, how are you doing avoidance and minimization now? Please put it down on paper. And that's what we were trying to do. I agree that it didn't make it more clear.
So, to To make an example, if you have say a quarter-acre lot, and half of it is wetland, and half of it is upland, and you have your 25 or 50-foot buffer, then the county says, no, you can only put in your house. And it has to be less than whatever, you could start dictating sizes of the house. You only get 1,500 square feet, cannot have a pool, cannot have a shed. That just, to me, seems a little bit onerous if it's already, it's got its future land use and zoning classification, that's what it is. Just kind of tough to say then that you can't use it all.
And I hear you, and I'm going to go to Wendy in a second, but what's kind of confounding me, because this is plain language. We're kind of going for something that's pretty plain language, refreshing. So I have the right to build a house on my property, and that's clear. I wouldn't necessarily assume that I have the right to put anything else on my property. I've had neighbors get into wars over sheds that are improperly sited on their property. So I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's like I would not expect that I can do anything beyond build my house. That's what I'm entitled to. We aren't saying you're entitled to have a pool because you have a house, or you're entitled to have a dock because you have a house, or you're entitled to have a shed because you have a house. You're entitled to have a house. So I don't know how to get around that, but that's kind of going in the plain language. I don't know. Jessica, then Wendy.
I was just going to try wordsmithing again, and I wonder, to Jack's point, if there's something about like intact wetlands, like if the accessory structure is going to impact intact wetlands, like wetlands that are still, wetland buffers that are still in good shape.
Your house avoided it.
Yeah, as opposed to the one that got cleared 50 years ago and is just, sawed to the wall. I mean, is there a way that we can distinguish in this language that we're talking about? Like, let's just not screw up anything that's still looking pretty good.
Clay is shaking his head, and it's going up and down like that.
Yeah.
Did you agree with me?
Yes.
Wow.
Well, wetlands and buffers cleared prior to the ordinance are exempt from the code. So we go back to the 1989, aerials, and we'll look at those. And if that buffer was cleared or impacted without permits, then we can make them do a restoration. And to what Bill says, we already can regulate the size of the house, and we have done so. And we have denied permits in the past well, I wouldn't say denied, we've requested changes, and they have changed their design to avoid impacts to wetlands and buffers in the past. So we've already had the ability to do all those things. This is kind of limiting what we can do.
But I think that we can come back with clarity of the language for 10, based on what you're stating today, to really show what we're doing. Like Keith just said, maybe we put in language that says that if you're cleared prior to this date, then you would have the ability to put accessory structures or your primary structure within the buffer, or things of that sort. So we can come back with that instead of trying to wordsmith it in here right now. So I think we understand where we're going, where y'all are going with it anyway.
I mean, we could strike that whole last sentence.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
But it's, we were trying to write down the things that we actually do.
Mm-hmm.
We could strike the sentence, we're still going to do what we've been doing, but.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the provision was created because we said, what do you do, and how do we put people on notice? And so a part of this, and I don't mean to say it's silly, but it's silly, guys, because we're looking at an area where you are trying to build a house on a lot that is comprised of mostly wetlands. There should be a different level of review there. Private property rights do not extend to the trampling of natural resources. And so I think that what we're trying to do here is make it clear what the rules are, identify what we've done in the past, and this is not the end. If you came forward and said, I wanted a pool, and staff said, you can't have a pool, under our wetland permitting, you're not allowed to encroach on that buffer, there are processes you can then go through to modify that. And so there are administrative routes to say, no, every other lot on our street didn't have the standard applied. They all have pools. I would like to be treated the same. There are equitable arguments for variances and things like that, that I think are available. But it sounds to me like we're talking about whether you should be able to permit wetlands outright if you have a single family house, or if you should follow rules that are in place. And so I just don't know where exactly we're going.
Tyler?
Right, so I think, I actually have problems with the first sentence just as much as I do the second sentence. I think I'm going to be the one that's out of line on this, but it says it allows for the reasonable use. When we look at the definition of the reasonable use, I didn't get from that you can tell me I have to have a smaller house just because I'm building in the buffer. So what is being applied in interpretation and control, and as Jessica put it, making people follow the rules, I think is beyond what the rules say today, because reasonable use is any and all economically viable vested use of the land allowed under the comp plan and development regulations. And so if I look at zoning and I have a 10,000 square foot lot and I want to build a 4,000 square foot house on it, and I'm allowed a 50% impervious coverage, and all of my stuff adds up and works, but my wetland line is halfway through the house, and they tell me, well, you're building too big of a house, buddy. Like, reasonable use says I'm not. It's economically viable for the parcel. I can afford the house. I struggle that what we're codifying is, again, an extension of the code further. I think we need to get more specific. Like, and I think that's what we've all been talking about, but even with, what within the reasonable use, if it's economically viable and it's allowed under, if the only development regulation is the wetland impact, then that's a circular thing where when we increase the development impact, we decrease the reasonable use. Every time we make the buffer bigger, I have less reasonable use of my property. At what point is it just zoning says 1,200 square foot minimum, that's the reasonable use, is I get a 1,200 square foot house exactly. Maybe we should say it's 150% or 200%, or, all of our zonings have a minimum square footage for the building. I just think we need to have something that clarifies reasonable use more.
Well, it does say under the land development regulations. So these are land development regulations, the avoidance and minimization. That's a reasonable use, but you have to meet all of those lot.
Well, under that, if the lot is wetland, I can't build on it because it says that I can't impact the wetland and I have to maintain a buffer. And so reasonably, I can't use my property.
But the land development code has mitigation and permitting requirements in it, so you have to meet all those permitting requirements. It's not saying you can't, it's just saying you have to meet all these requirements.
I think ultimately my point is the discretion lies in your hands on how big of a house somebody can build if they're impacting wetlands. And it just leads to gray areas in the code, and it's the unequal treatment of one person over another, because how good I am at arguing, or maybe I'm not the person that would be arguing, but how good the environmentalist that's hired is at arguing with you could make a difference in the outcome of the project. And I just think that more clarity would help in both sentences. I'm not trying to say don't have some reasonable restrictions even. I just think we need to define them.
No, and I think that did come up early on too, because we did say in reasonable use, is it if you have a 30% building coverage, that's how much you get, right? That's a maximum, but what is the reasonable? And so that is something that, I don't know if you guys have a tried and true method of how you would apply that, but that came up in earlier discussions, so that would be interesting to see. Bliss?
I would say a lot of it depends on how the person, the applicant, asks the question. Because if they don't have a good understanding of all of this, and they don't ask the question correctly because they don't know how to, the answer is no. But if you are educated, or you hire the professional land development, the engineer, then you have a team of people who know how to ask the question on your behalf. So, I deal with this a lot of times. People are like, oh, well, I went over and I said this. And I'm like, what'd you say that for? It's how you ask the question and who you got that day and whether or not they had the time to walk you through it and talk you through it, or whether it was, one of the people who said, they said, no, you can't, and they go, oh, okay, and they're done.
So guys, we were at 3:58, and I'm not seeing any more cards, and I don't know that we necessarily
I've got
gave you
mine
the.
up.
Oh, sorry, Alex, you're hiding.
Is there any way that we can tie this avoidance minimization to the actual UMAM vector, like the change on what happens on the property? Is there any certain reason why, other than it just being kind of sort of complicated for non-sciencey people to understand? Okay. I guess where I was going with that is we're trying to prevent basically like shopping malls popping up in buffers and having nothing but concrete until the wetland edge. So like an ancillary structure that's put up on stilts doesn't necessarily impact the hydrologic value component of that wetland as much as something else does. So that that kind of vector in the UMAM would be much, much less than putting like a concrete pad down and all that kind of stuff.
Some of the other
associated with
counties had
building.
maximums, like there was a maximum amount of buffer you could impact.
Yeah.
And you could look at it that way. You could say, if you've got a 50-foot buffer, the maximum you could impact is 25 feet. We could write this any way that you guys would like to see it. So you could have minimums and maximums. It's kind of almost like an average thing. But you could make it more concrete so it's not so subjective. But we weren't trying to really handcuff everybody to you can only impact 50% of the buffer or 30% of the buffer. But if that's what this board's desire is, then yes, we can do that.
Okay. I guess that's all I have right now.
Nine, good luck. No, but we have the agenda conference meeting for tomorrow. It was, we were trying to get it on for the 3rd, but unfortunately it got bumped to the 17th. It's all set to go. We're providing them with all the documentation. The agenda should be up hopefully by Friday. You'll be able to download all the documentation and the PowerPoint. There's a slide that lists 5 different options. So they will be given the option of, the no build, don't do anything. One, make it voluntary, make it mandatory, do the hybrid that y'all have recommended, or don't take any action until after November 2024. The one big problem is that Senate Bill 250, since basically all we can do is do a voluntary process until October 1, 2024, and the elections are occurring in November of 2024. One of the council members identified, well, why are we going to be making rules for a potentially new council? I'm just telling you, that's the way it was identified, so. But it is definitely on the agenda. I'll know better. Well, you'll see. It'll be probably later in the meeting.
I thought that with what we were taking to them on the 17th was also really to the point of authorizing you all to use the audit tool to
Yes,
come
it
back with
is.
language.
That's in there too.
Okay.
That is in there.
I didn't realize it was to actually vote on one of the 5 options.
And originally, just until the other day, when SB 250 was signed, we were going to go to them and they were going to vote on that, both the audit tool and whether our recommendation, which was hybrid, but they can't. So we resolved to share our recommendation anyway, and they could urge people to voluntarily comply with it. But no, the only action they can take is that audit tool. You're right to bring that up. So we're over our time. We did not conclude with 10. We unearthed some concerns with it. Shall we ask staff to come back with some changes to 10 again? Or shall we do like Wendy and do wordsmithing on our own?
No, I thought that's what you were going to do, right? I mean, you were going to look at that.
Do we need a motion?
Okay. Anything else?
I move we adjourn.
I
Doesn't need a
Wait.
second.
Just continue where we left off last time, there's no original homework for us, other than, we know we need to try to work on the plan.
Actually, I'm sorry if she said anything else. If you could add Brevard to,
Yeah. And say the adjacent counties.
that would be helpful.
Yeah, and Lake would probably be good too.
Snacks? It's
Tremendously large.
yes. Use AI to comb through it.
Maybe not specific examples as it relates to Farmington, just something else associated with PRs. Maybe even how it's historically used around the entire state of Florida. Not specifically 120 hours of home.
Okay. Have we put in all of our requests? We're all, I asked for snacks, but thank you. We're adjourned.